Charlie Spiering, author of the book of Kamala Harris, Amateur Hour, Kamala Harris in the White House. Charlie, how you doing, brother?
Hey, Mike. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, good to talk to you. So we actually kicked off in our monologue. We played the whole moment from the debate when she became the vice president, when she did the whole "that girl was me" routine. So take us back to that girl. Who was that girl when she was a little girl, Kamala Harris?
Yeah, Mike, that's kind of why the attack kind of bounced off, because it didn't really make much sense that somehow a little girl living in Berkeley, California was suffering from, a very difficult period of time growing up as a girl who was, half Jamaican and half Asian. So it didn't really sort of swing with the idea that somehow she was a victim of the deeply segregated society of Berkeley, California. But anyway, it was definitely something she was trying to sell on the debate stage. And she had actually done this attack before. When I was researching a lot of this, she tried to utilize this attack during the Kavanaugh hearings. And it was very surprising to hear very much the same rhetoric being used at that time.
Well, what did she say then?
The very same kind of argument was that, if we are considering someone on the Supreme Court, this is very important, because if it hadn't been for X or Y decision, then I might not have been able to ride a school bus as a little girl, and I might not be a United States senator. It kind of widely was, dismissed at the time. It was an obvious ploy at the time, and it didn't have much to do with Brett Kavanaugh's qualifications, but it was very fascinating to see that same attack being recycled for the 2020 primary debate against Joe Biden.
You mean the race card? Surely. Tell us about
famous,
her parents.
I don't think you're a racist, but you are a racist.
Yeah, right? One parent from India and the other from Jamaica. What do we know about these two people?
Well, they both met at Berkeley, and even though Kamala likes to talk about how they were, marching and shouting for justice, these two people were not necessarily protesters first, right? They were very more academic. Kamala's father was a very good speaker, was a teacher. He was one of these leaders in this sort of Black study group, the Afro-American study group in Berkeley. And this was kind of a very radical, intellectually Marxist group. And they, former members of the group sort of talked about how they, idolized people like Fidel Castro and Chairman Mao from China. And so this was kind of the intellectual background that her family was steeped in before they sort of emerged eventually to become more practical people. And of course, they ultimately divorced when she was, I think they ultimately separated and divorced when she was 7 years old.
Okay. So I wonder how much of his Marxist background and Marxist philosophy and teaching influenced her as a child. Did they have much engagement together when she was young?
Yeah, they spent some time together, but the majority of her time was spent with her mother, who was kind of a little more no nonsense, a little more practical. As a single mother, she didn't have very much time for any deep-seated Marxist theory. While her father was sort of described in I think he taught at Stanford. He was described as a Marxist scholar, someone who was very charismatic and who so she would have had a little more of an intellectual underpinning to sort of understand where she stood on these issues. But I think ultimately that she kind of turned aside from that sort of more fundamental Marxist ideas and philosophy to something a little more practical.
How did she, when she was younger, before she maybe used it to her political advantage, but how did she view her race? We talked the other day we did a special on Michelle Obama, and the historians we had on said that she had nothing to do with the Black community in Chicago. They call her an Oreo, black on the outside, white on the inside. She did everything she could to avoid going to the local black school, et cetera, et cetera. So that was her racial upbringing. What was Kamala's?
Well, Kamala was, half Jamaican, half Indian, and certainly she kind of was happy to sort of straddle both sides as she was running for office in in this time. But you see after she starts running nationally, how she really tries to bring forward a little more of a Black Southern identity. This is when she starts talking about her second mother. This is a woman who lived close to them and took care of them while their mother was at work. The second mother was a little more connected with the Christian South and the Black church, and so she'll talk about how she used to sing in the choir, and how this woman would take her to go sing in the Black choir, and she grew up kind of having this deep understanding of the food and the culture of the Black South, even though it was not necessarily true, but it's certainly something she emphasized more and more as she moved her brand more nationally.
We talked also the other day with Michelle about her memoir and how it's just a constructed political creation. What have you learned from Kamala's memoir, The Truths We Hold?
Yeah, Kamala's memoir is very focused on her sort of, one of her favorite quotes is her mother saying, don't let other people tell your story. You tell your story. And Kamala's very good at that, sort of telling exactly how she wants to be seen instead of the actual truth. There's no mention of Willie Brown, for example, in Kamala's memoir, even though he had a very fundamental role in her early political and social career. So it's very interesting. It's pretty canned. There's only a few like true, honest moments. She always talks about how she used to march and protesting with her parents, marching and shouting, and how she, at one point she fell out of her stroller. Tells this funny story about how, she got left behind. She fell out of her stroller. Her parents left her behind, and when her mother came back to find her, she said, "What do you want?" And she famously, according to Kamala, she famously said, "Freedom," which immediately drew some skeptical audiences because the story was sort of exactly the same as one shared by Martin Luther King in an old magazine article. So there was definitely a lot of skepticism, like, is Kamala just making this up? Is this plagiarized from Martin Luther King, or did this actually happen? Funny thing, the first time she told that story about falling out of her stroller was in a magazine article. And then later when she gives her speech for vice president, she talks about herself being always strapped tightly in the stroller. So it's kind of one of these shifting detail stories that typically happens with politicians as the years go on.
Yeah, of course. When you were researching Kamala, what was something that was surprising to you?
Well, what's interesting is she moved from Berkeley to Montreal, Canada, and that's sort of where she became even more distant from sort of the American culture. She was more steeped in sort of semi-wealthy Montreal, and she spent most of her high school years in Montreal and kind of experienced America through a slightly different lens. And she grew up in a pretty wealthy neighborhood in Montreal. Her mom had a pretty solid position and making a good deal of money. So she really, when she got back to the States, she was really kind of distant from any sort of experience from most Black Americans, or most, in the South, and certainly a lot of Black Americans in the rest of the world. I talked and listened to a lot of Black activists who, actively, could not identify with Kamala Harris because of her different upbringing.
How old was she when she was in Canada?
I think she was in high school mostly, and so she spent a good time of her formative years growing up in Canada.
Yes, absolutely. Wow, that is different. That is dramatic. That's very, very important. My last question for you, Charlie, and I want to encourage everyone to go read the book. What would be your biggest concern if we had a President Kamala Harris, even if it was just for, a couple months or whatnot? What's your concern?
Yeah, I think that when I was doing the research of the book, what strikes me the most is her ability to be sort of unmoored from principles. She's very ambitious. She'll talk from both sides of an issue. She'll change her opinion on issues very easily and very rapidly. No fundamental intellectual underpinnings. She just kind of has this very craven desire for power. She wants to be the next Barack Obama. She wants to be the next political inspirational figure. And that's sort of what drove her to run in 2020. And ultimately, that campaign was a flop. Once voters saw who she really was, how she didn't necessarily have a plan or a message or something that she wanted to really encourage Americans beyond her own sort of craven desire for power, I think that's when they ultimately turned on her and looked towards other people. If Kamala Harris becomes president, she'll be very vengeful, and she's very upset with the Biden team. She feels like she's been mistreated by them. And so I think that there's going to be a lot of house cleaning in the upper echelons of the West Wing if she does take power. And certainly you're going to have somebody who's just out there absolutely ready to wield whatever power the presidency has to, A, punish her enemies and reward her friends.
I only got about 30 seconds, but do you think she has the chops to follow through on said ambition and desire for power? Does she intellectually have the ability?
Well, she first has to learn how to connect with audiences and speak in a way that inspires people. That's the number one job of the president, is to inspire the American people and move them towards a higher goal, a higher purpose. Right now, her vice presidency is rife with examples of word salads, missed opportunities, and failed attempts to communicate. So she either has to figure that out and sort of reassert herself, remake herself. She's already tried to do several reboots, but I think the emerging Kamala Harris that people have in their minds is someone who's incompetent, and that's sort of why I wrote the book Amateur Hour in the beginning.
Yeah, that's right. Charlie Spiering, Amateur Hour, Kamala Harris in the White House. Charlie, great to talk to you. Appreciate it.